How did the destiny of an empire and the lives of millions vanish under the iron will of a single man sworn to absolute obedience? History recorded Hideki Tojo as the man who combined the ruthlessness of ancient samurai codes with the destructiveness of modern warfare. This ascent, beginning beneath the rigid discipline of the military academy, carried him through the dark intelligence webs of the Kempeitai to the highest political summit of Tokyo. Civilian will was crushed step by step, political opponents were silenced, and the sword of the army was made the sole law of the state. This absolute power brought forth a profound arrogance, culminating in that irreversible decision which dragged millions into the dark waters of the Pacific and the deadly jungles of Southeast Asia. In this historic epic of destruction, stretching from the flaming wreckage of Pearl Harbor to the deep waters of Midway, from the fall of Saipan to the heavy atmosphere of the Tokyo trials, the collapse of a nation, a loss of power overshadowed by suicide attempts, and all the truths of an era that ultimately ended on the gallows were brought to light. Throughout this narrative, how the great ambition that ignited the war confronted the cold face of justice, and the anatomy of the dark era that sealed the fate of Asia were entirely revealed. If this solemn journey into the depths of history pleases you, you might consider liking our video and subscribing to our channel for our sleep-inducing documentaries. Furthermore, we kindly invite you to share your valuable suggestions and recommendations regarding our narration and content in the comments section. Now, the heavy veil of time drew back to a freezing winter day in 1884, and the doors of the silent house, where that absolute, obedient sword of the empire was forged, slowly opened. Hideki Tojo was born on a dark winter day in Tokyo on December 30th, 1884. His father, Hidenori Tojo, belonged to the old samurai class, a remnant of the feudal era, and simultaneously served as a commissioned officer in the newly established Imperial Japanese Army. This lineage determined not only the young Tojo's surname, but the entire course of his life. The codes of Bushido, the way of the warrior, acted as the unwritten law of daily life in the household. The uncompromising stance of the traditional Japanese warrior class in the face of honor, loyalty, and death blended with the military hierarchy of the modernizing nation. The atmosphere inside the home took shape around strict discipline and absolute loyalty to the divine presence of the emperor. Tojo's earliest memories coincided with a transitional period where the ancient legends of sword masters gave way to modern artillery fire and regular infantry formations. The young Tojo did not escape his destiny and walked through the heavy iron gates of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy to prepare for a military career. Within the academy walls, there was no room for individuality, personal opinions, or doubt. They were all systematically erased. Every student was rebuilt to become a flawlessly functioning cog in a colossal and ruthless military machine. The physical drills that began in the freezing cold of the early morning hours, the mental endurance tests that lasted until midnight, and the strategy lessons essentially forged Tojo's character on a red-hot anvil. Failure, weakness, or the slightest disobedience to an order met punishment not only through physical violence, but with profound shame. Inside this oppressive and suffocating system, Tojo permanently engraved the principles of absolute obedience, an unshakable chain of command and unconditional submission to the emperor's authority into his mind. He became not merely a man in the corridors of the academy, but the obedient sword of the empire. In the cold February of 1904, the Russo-Japanese War, which changed the fate of the Asian continent, broke out. Japan, rapidly rising in Asia, industrializing and outgrowing its borders, entered a life-or-death struggle with a massive Western empire. The intense militaristic wind that enveloped the entire Japanese society during this war deeply affected the souls of the young officer candidates at the academy. The military marches echoing in the streets, the bloody tales of heroism told by wounded soldiers returning from the fronts of Port Arthur and Mukden, and the state's relentless war propaganda shaped Tojo's worldview. His belief that military power was the only valid law in the world for Japan to survive, avoid being crushed by Western powers, and expand, found an unshakable foundation during these years. In the autumn of 1905, the conclusion of the war, with Japan's decisive victory, cemented the Army's untouchable and sacred position within society. As the whole world watched how a small Asian island brought the massive Russian army to its knees, Tojo graduated from the academy amidst this intoxication of victory, as one of the new generation of officers prepared to carry the empire to much broader lands in the future, and donned his officer's uniform. When the bloody and destructive storm of the First World War, which took millions of lives in the trenches, subsided, the Imperial Japanese Army immediately took action to study the new military realities in Europe. In 1919, Hideki Tojo, as one of the Army's notable officers, traveled to Europe with the title of military attaché, first to Switzerland and then to Germany, which emerged ruined from the war, but preserved its deep-rooted military tradition. This assignment not only broadened his strategic horizon, but also fundamentally changed his vision regarding the nature of future wars. During his time in Europe, he personally witnessed that the traditional concept of warfare fell entirely behind. He saw that modern warfare no longer consisted merely of armies clashing on battlefields, but transformed into the concept of total war, where the entire industrial, economic, and social strength of nations mobilized for the field. During his inspections in Germany, he deeply analyzed the structure of the German military organization, state discipline, and the functioning of the general staff. He noted in detail in his reports that the logistical networks keeping massive armies afloat, railway lines, ammunition shipments, and heavy industry facilities stood as the most vital elements determining the fate of military operations. The tremendous industrial production capacities and inexhaustible economic resources of Western states awakened a great echo in Tojo's mind. He decided that there was only one way for Japan, a small island nation, to compete with these massive powers, achieve its goals on the Asian continent, and secure its own existence. All the state's civil bureaucracy, its people, and its economic wheels required complete mobilization in line with military objectives. This belief in absolute dedication permanently took root in his mind on the cold streets and in the barracks of Europe. He clearly understood that steel foundries, coal mines, and uninterrupted supply routes won wars, no longer just soldiers holding weapons. This idea of militaristic integration, which required not just military but total national obedience, laid the groundwork for the policies that Tojo used to transform the Japanese Empire into a ruthless war machine locked onto a single target in the following years. In the mid-1930s, Manchuria became the Japanese Empire's most strategic and simultaneously darkest stronghold in Asia. The state of Manchukuo, independent on paper, actually consisted of a puppet regime ruled under the iron fist of the Japanese Kwantung Army. On this massive landmass, the army established an autonomous state mechanism. In the freezing September of 1935, Hideki Tojo took command of the military police organization, the Kempeitai, which acted as the most dangerous and secretive weapon of this tremendous military power. This appointment marked the beginning of a ruthless internal purge process that changed the fate of not only Manchuria, but also Japanese political history. The Kempeitai did not act as an ordinary law enforcement force. It functioned as the intelligence network, secret service, and, when necessary, the firing squad of the Imperial Army. When Tojo took over this organization, he reconstructed the existing structure from top to bottom. He transformed the agency from an irregular apparatus of oppression into a flawlessly operating, cold, and analytical surveillance machine. He registered rival factions within the army, officials defending civil authority in the Japanese bureaucracy, and local dissidents in Manchuria, one by one, through a massive profiling network. Kempeitai agents roaming the dark streets of the cities, train stations, and government offices relayed the slightest whisper of disobedience directly to the thick files in Tojo's headquarters. Sudden raids breaking the silence of the night, long hours spent in basement interrogation rooms, and the subsequent untraceable disappearances became the cornerstone of his governance style. Tojo exercised this immense authority he acquired to its absolute limits in an uncompromising manner. He mobilized all the intelligence capabilities of the state to turn the power struggles within the Imperial Japanese Army in his favor. He exiled dissenting officers to distant garrisons, demoted their ranks, and ruthlessly crushed factions rebelling against the army hierarchy without facing any legal obstacles. His nature of examining informant files for hours at his desk, in his room, behind his thick-framed glasses, etching even the smallest detail into his memory, stood out as the most terrifying aspect of his character. The decisions he made during this period remained so sharp, his attitude so ruthless, and his intellect possessed such cold-blooded clarity that the Japanese military and political circles gave him the nickname Kamisori, meaning the razor. He possessed a bureaucratic mindset that, instead of solving problems through diplomacy or negotiation, cut them off at the root like a razor. The razor nickname went down in history as an unofficial title, symbolizing how he pierced through obstacles, how he silenced dissenting voices forever, and how he monopolized the military mechanism. As a result of this iron-fisted rule lasting approximately 2 years, the balance of power within the state irrevocably shifted in favor of the Japanese army. The weak influence of the civilian government in Manchuria shattered entirely. Civilian governors and diplomats fell to the position of mere extras in the shadow of the army headquarters. The absolute tutelage of the army over politics institutionalized during this era. Through these systematic purges, Tojo established an unquestionable authority within the Kwantung Army and engraved his name into the minds of the political elites in Tokyo with deep fear. As one of the empire's most feared figures on the Asian continent, he accelerated his march toward larger centers of power that inevitably dragged his country to the abyss. On the night of July 7, 1937, a dark, armed clash erupted at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. A few rifle shots heard at midnight quickly ignited that great spark, which dragged the Asian continent into a bloody destruction lasting for years. This regional tension, which started between border troops, turned into an all-out war of life and death between the Japanese Empire and the Republic of China. Immediately after the incident, the tension on the borderlines escalated rapidly, and the doors for diplomatic negotiations closed completely. Once the military mechanism went into motion, it became an unstoppable avalanche. In the midst of this colossal crisis, Hideki Tojo assumed the position of Chief of Staff of that massive force in Manchuria, the Kwantung Army. He now stood as one of the highest-ranking commanders, managing not just intelligence files or police reports, but the lives of millions of soldiers, thousands of tons of ammunition shipments, and continent-wide war plans. He personally executed all the military planning of the large-scale invasion of Chinese territories, down to the finest logistical detail on the giant maps in his headquarters. He now applied the concept of total war, which he learned while studying Western doctrines, on a real battlefield. He put forward his entire tactical genius, from the provisioning of the soldiers to the use of railways for military purposes and the deployment of reserve troops to the front. However, Tojo wanted to prove that he did not merely act as a bureaucrat making decisions at a desk. He went directly to the front line himself to carry his plans from paper to the actual battlefield. He directly led the Chahar operation, which began in August 1937. In this assault offensive, launched towards the southwest of Manchuria into the strategic depths of China, he managed the coordination of armored units, motorized infantry, and artillery batteries right from the line of fire. He maintained his composure from the staff rooms amidst the chaos of the battlefield as well. With decisive, uncompromising, and highly aggressive tactics, he drove the Japanese troops onto the Chinese lines. This active role on the battlefield proved to the entire Japanese command echelon that he stood not only as a military policeman, but also as a capable and ruthless army commander. Faced with the heavy artillery fire and continuously advancing armored columns of the Kwantung Army, the Chinese defense lines collapsed one after another. The clashes in the Chahar region proved fierce and ruthless. Villages turned to ash, and defense trenches broke into pieces. The Chinese forces suffered extremely heavy losses. The scattered Chinese troops, having lost their resistance, desperately retreated towards the deeper and mountainous parts of the country, along with massive casualties. Tojo's military success in this operation redrew the borders on the Asian mainland and carried the Japanese Empire's dominance on the continent to an unprecedented depth. This absolute victory he won on the battlefield prepared the greatest foundation needed for his march to the center of power in Tokyo by rapidly climbing the political ranks. The echoes of the decisive and bloody victories won in continental Asia quickly resonated through the corridors of the Japanese capital. His indisputable successes on the battlefield, his discipline, and his organizational brilliance led to Hideki Tojo's summons directly from the Kwantung Army to the political center of the empire, Tokyo. In 1938, he returned to the capital with the title of Vice Minister of War. This appointment stood not just as the promotion of a successful soldier, but as the clearest sign of the army bureaucracy's final siege on civilian politics. The commander, emerging from the shadows and intelligence networks of Manchuria, now directly took his place in the heart of the state's highest executive organs. With his return to Tokyo, the army's political pressure on the civilian government reached an unprecedented level, an almost suffocating peak. Tojo functioned as an uncompromising and iron-willed bridge that imposed the boundless demands of the military headquarters on the civilian cabinet. Elected politicians, diplomats, and civil bureaucrats grew a little more desperate each passing day in the face of the military demands he laid on the table. The decision-making mechanisms militarized step by step. Moderate officials who expressed opposing views faced intimidation, dismissal from office, or complete purge through military-backed political pressure. During this process, Tojo became one of the most key and feared figures in the military bureaucracy, holding the highest political power in the decision-making mechanism. The war Japan maintained in the Chinese quagmire lasted much longer than expected, despite the initial intoxication of victory, and it began to rapidly deplete the empire's limited resources. Keeping millions of soldiers on the continent, protecting massive logistical lines, and constantly feeding the army required an extraordinary economic transformation. Tojo brought the total war vision he championed since his military attaché days in Europe into play right at this point. To finance Japan's long-term war in China, he prepared heavy policies that completely allocated all the state's economic resources, heavy industry, civilian production capacity, and manpower to the command of the army. He ensured the ruthless enforcement of the national mobilization law across every level of the state. The daily consumption of the civilian population met tight quotas, commercial factories fully transformed into military production lines, and all raw material resources held by the country flowed directly to the front. The state ceased to be a civil bureaucracy and turned into a military barracks, serving a single massive war with all its economic and social cogs. This new, rigid militaristic order Tojo built in Tokyo effectively eliminated civil administration and inevitably brought the empire to the brink of a much larger global war that would unfold in the waters of the Pacific. During the gloomy and tense days of 1940, the balance of power in Tokyo, the capital of the Japanese Empire, shifted completely and irreversibly. The heavy atmosphere created by the prolonged war on the Asian continent seeped into the highest decision-making mechanisms of the state. Hideki Tojo assumed the office of the Minister of War and entered the cabinet directly, carrying the weight of the unshakable authority he gained in the Kwantung army and through internal military purges. His entry into the cabinet was not an ordinary ministerial appointment or a political changing of the guard. This step stood as the clearest and most concrete declaration that the military bureaucracy had completely taken over the civilian government. The decisions made behind the heavy wooden doors and in the cold stone corridors of the Ministry of War building now determined the single and absolute course of the entire Japanese state. While the borders of the war expanded rapidly on the European continent during the same period, Japan turned its eyes toward the rising new and aggressive powers of the West. In September 1940, Japan took that monumental step that would fundamentally shake the global balance. It officially signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. This pact was not a mundane diplomatic cooperation agreement on paper. It was a dark and destructive military alliance that divided the world into spheres of influence declaring that totalitarian regimes marched shoulder to shoulder toward a global objective. Hideki Tojo stepped forward with all his might as the strongest, most fiery, and most aggressive defender of this alliance during the inner cabinet debates held behind closed doors. In his strategic vision, forging a common destiny with Germany and Italy to establish the empire's absolute dominance in Asia, and to break the influence of Western powers in the region, remained an unavoidable necessity. With the signing of the Tripartite Pact and the increase of Tojo's weight in the cabinet, the final moderate voices within the Japanese state structure also sank into a permanent silence. The maneuvering space for civilian diplomacy completely narrowed, virtually vanishing, in the face of the Minister of War's uncompromising and aggressive military policies. The right to speak was stripped away from ambassadors, experienced diplomats, and civilian bureaucrats seeking peaceful resolutions to international crises. Foreign policy was no longer shaped by the elegant diplomacy of Foreign Office corridors, but by the decisive orders of soldiers over large war maps in Army headquarters. During this process, the Army rose to the position of the sole and absolute determinant of politics. Civilian cabinet members and the Parliament transformed into mere figurehead mechanisms that only formalized the decisions previously made by the military. Under the iron will of Hideki Tojo and the binding shadow of the Tripartite Pact, Japan broke its own shell and entered an irreversible path toward that great Pacific storm which would alter the fate of the entire world. Diplomatic tables were overturned, negotiation doors closed, and the empire accelerated its march with all its weight toward that approaching colossal clash. As the gloomy months of 1941 progressed, the tension between the two shores of the Pacific Ocean reached a breaking point. Japan's relentless advance in the Chinese quagmire and its growing military appetite for the Indochina region completely exhausted the strategic patience of the United States. The Washington administration no longer remained a spectator to the rapidly changing balance of power in Asia and the Japanese empire's swallowing of the continent. Going beyond political reactions and diplomatic notes, extremely heavy and devastating economic sanctions came into effect one after another. The United States initiated a severe embargo on oil, steel, and scrap metal as a definitive response to Japan's occupations in Asia. This embargo decision was not a simple commercial restriction for Japan, but a fatal blow struck directly to the heart of its economy and army. The empire's colossal war machine. Its giant battleships patrolling the oceans, its fleets covering the sky, and its mechanized units relentlessly advancing into China relied completely on externally imported oil. Energy resources on Japan's own soil were virtually non-existent, and it procured the vast majority of its oil from America. With the sudden closure of the American oil valves, the strategic reserves serving as the lifeblood of the empire rapidly reached the point of depletion. The reality that the fuel stocks held by the Navy and the Army would last only a few months created deep panic and an existential crisis in the corridors of the military headquarters in Tokyo. Time worked against Japan like a ruthless countdown clock. The civilian government and moderate diplomats entered a desperate traffic of negotiations with Washington to escape this impending economic strangulation. The search for a diplomatic resolution between the two countries lasted for weeks on the Washington and Tokyo line. However, the refusal of both sides to compromise on their core interests turned the negotiations into an intractable deadlock. The United States laid down the complete withdrawal of the Japanese army from China and its newly occupied territories as an absolute, rigid precondition for lifting the oil embargo. This uncompromising demand on the diplomatic table created a virtual earthquake effect among the Japanese military elites. The moment Minister of War Hideki Tojo heard this demand, he mentally overturned the diplomatic table completely. Tojo decisively and uncompromisingly refused to retreat from the continental lands, watered with the blood of hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers, and conquered through years of heavy economic costs. To him, bowing to this demand meant trampling the army's honor underfoot, nullifying all past sacrifices, and condemning the empire to a weakness that would last for decades. The doors to a diplomatic solution closed one by one under Tojo's iron will and the army's pressure. In the state's highest-level strategy meetings, rather than slowly bleeding out and perishing under the devastating effects of the embargo, he laid out the option of armed conflict on the table as the only inevitable path to survive with the empire's honor. Japan now stood on the edge of the abyss, and as the economic circle tightened, the course of war pointed out by the Minister of War became the state's sole reality. By October 1941, the political atmosphere in Tokyo reached an almost suffocating heaviness. As the suffocating circle, created by the American embargo, tightened day by day, the civilian government's room for maneuver and diplomatic options completely vanished. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe struggled with a final hope to reach a diplomatic consensus with the United States and prevent the impending destruction. However, he was mercilessly crushed between Washington's uncompromising stance and the Japanese military wing's rigid, unyielding attitude. When the deadline granted by the Army for diplomacy expired, Konoe could no longer find the power, authority, and political support within himself to govern the state. Losing all his resistance in the face of heavy criticisms, veiled threats, and endless pressure rising from the Army headquarters, civilian Prime Minister Konoe resigned from his post on October 16, 1941. In desperation and a profound sense of defeat. This resignation was the final nail in the coffin of civilian politics in Japan, marking the complete surrender of parliamentary will before the army's sword. Immediately following Konoe's resignation, a historic decision that would determine Japan's fate was made in the deep, silent, and wood-paneled corridors of the Imperial Palace. Emperor Hirohito saw only one center of power, capable of holding the state together amidst the approaching global storm and ensuring absolute obedience by keeping the various factions of the army under control. On October 17th, the emperor handed the task of forming the government and the seal of the state directly to Minister of War Hideki Tojo. This decision stood as an unprecedented turning point in Japanese political history. As Tojo sat in the prime minister's seat, he united the military and civilian administration into a single iron fist in his own person. He did not merely content himself with being the civilian head of the government. He also retained the office of Minister of War to hold absolute control of the army and directly manage operational plans. He did not stop there, but also took over the seat of the Minister of Internal Affairs to completely control the domestic police force, civilian obedience, intelligence, and national security. All military, political, bureaucratic, and internal security mechanisms of the state now rested on the shoulders of a single man, the general nicknamed the Razor, and his uniform. The civilian bureaucracy fell completely under military authority, Dissenting voices were silenced by the police network of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the Ministry of War became the sole decision-making authority in the country. This new cabinet established by Tojo functioned less as crisis management and more as a ruthless war committee preparing the nation for a total war. The first and most vital file resting on Tojo's desk as he took the prime minister's seat concerned the depleting oil reserves and the impending economic collapse. The last-minute diplomatic negotiations conducted with Washington throughout November definitively collapsed, with American Secretary of State Cordell Hull's harsh ultimatum demanding Japan's withdrawal from all its conquests in Asia. Following the complete exhaustion of diplomatic channels, the Imperial Conference, Gozen Kaigi, the state's highest decision-making body, convened in Tokyo behind the thick walls of the Imperial Palace. In this historic and gloomy meeting, which Emperor Hirohito watched silently from his high throne almost as a divine figure, the highest-ranking figures of the state, admirals, generals, and loyal ministers gathered together. Tojo laid the final war reports prepared by the Army and Navy, logistical maps, and the chart of depleting resources on the table. He argued in decisive, uncompromising, and cold-blooded terms that the economic blockade acted as a poison slowly killing the country, and that drawing the sword remained the only way to escape this poison, rather than Japan bowing down in submission. The heavy silence in the conference room deepened further with the historical magnitude of the decision made. After brief negotiations, options for diplomatic retreat or surrender were completely rejected. The mobilization of the armed forces to protect Japan's existence, honor, and chance of survival in Asia received approval through an absolute decision. As a result of the meeting, the decision for an all-out war against the United States, the master of the Pacific Ocean, against Britain with its colonies in Asia, and against the oil-rich Dutch East Indies was officially made. With the making of the decision, the military mechanism began to operate like an unstoppable system of gears. Those irreversible, secret attack orders were silently transmitted over radio frequencies from the dark headquarters of the capital Tokyo to the naval commanders waiting in the open seas, the aircraft carriers in the ports, and the army troops on the continent. In late November 1941, the massive Japanese combined fleet silently weighed anchor from the freezing, foggy, and desolate waters of the Kuril Islands. This colossal armada, consisting of 6 giant aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, battleships, and destroyers, entered absolute radio silence in order to remain completely hidden from American intelligence networks and patrol aircraft. Amidst the stormy, dark, and dangerous waves of the North Pacific, they advanced eastward, completely cut off from the outside world. As the gray steel hulls of the ships pierced the gloomy waters of the ocean, the crew knew that the approaching storm broke not only from the sea, but from within history itself. Throughout this tense ocean crossing that lasted for days, no one outside the chain of command learned the fleet's true destination. This remained the case until the order designating Hawaii as the target was decisively given from the bridge of the flagship Akagi. In the early hours of Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, the deep silence over the Pacific Ocean was torn apart by the engine roar of hundreds of warplanes taking off in succession from the wooden decks of the aircraft carriers, while the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, located on Hawaii's island of Oahu and acting as the heart of the American Pacific Fleet, lay in the lethargy and deep sleep of a Sunday morning, The black dots appearing in the sky rapidly grew. Japanese Zero fighter planes, Valdive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers appeared on the horizon, taking the sun behind them. When the clocks showed 7:55, one of the most flawlessly planned and devastating surprise air raids seen in military history struck its target. Torpedoes approaching from just above the water's surface violently shattered the steel hulls of the giant American battleships anchored side by side in the harbor. Armor-piercing bombs, screaming down from the sky, pierced through the decks of the ships and reached the ammunition magazines. The battleship USS Arizona, upon a massive bomb hitting its deck and igniting its armory, blew up into the air as a fireball hundreds of meters high and settled at the bottom of the ocean within seconds, along with over 1,000 of its sailors. The harbor remained under pitch-black smoke produced by burning oil. Colossal warships broke apart, listed, and capsized. The American Pacific Fleet suffered paralysis as a result of this relentless bombardment that lasted a mere 2 hours. However, the strategic plan of the Imperial headquarters in Tokyo was not limited to merely striking Hawaii. While Pearl Harbor was in flames, and the eyes of the entire world turned to this small island in the middle of the ocean, the Japanese army simultaneously sprang into action across the Asian coastlines, spanning thousands of kilometers. A colossal military mechanism descended upon enemy lines with a flawless synchronization that accounted even for time zone differences. Japanese planes conducted heavy bombardments on the air bases located in the American-controlled Philippines, destroying American aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. During those same hours, Navy-supported ground troops made a landing on the forested shores of the Malaya Peninsula, which was seen as the British Empire's invincible fortress in Asia. From another flank, ground assaults accompanied by fierce artillery fire began against the defense lines in Hong Kong, one of Asia's most strategic ports. The Pacific Ocean transformed into an all-out battlefield, engulfed in flames from end to end, as a result of a single plan, a single decision, and a single night. The first reports of these massive and multi-front attacks reached the military headquarters in Tokyo, second by second, via encrypted telegrams. Following the news of success, the Japanese state mechanism put official procedures into motion. Prime Minister and Minister of War Hideki Tojo sat before the heavy metal microphones of the state radio in one of the cold and silent rooms of the Ministry of War. He appeared before the entire nation with a highly stern, cold-blooded, and authoritarian demeanor, bearing no trace of emotion on his face. Through that historic radio broadcast, delivered in a steady, metallic tone of voice, he announced to the Japanese nation and to all of Asia that the war officially began. He declared that the sword was drawn from its scabbard for the survival, independence, and continued existence of the empire, and that an irreversible path was now taken against the United States of America and the British Empire. As the civilian population listened to the words echoing this cold and definitive proclamation by their radios, the fate of Asia descended into an irreversible darkness, with this war decision pouring from Tojo's lips. Before the black smoke rising from the wreckage of the Pearl Harbor base even dispersed, the Imperial Japanese Army advanced with an unprecedented military speed through the deep, hot, and supposedly impassable tropical jungles of Southeast Asia. Japanese infantrymen, whom Western military strategists thought could not last for weeks, turned the harsh terrain conditions to their advantage. The troops landing on the Malaya Peninsula rapidly crossed the forested areas by using bicycles and light weapons instead of heavy equipment. British defense lines collapsed one after another in the face of these shocking and extraordinarily fast encirclement tactics. The Japanese forces also seized air superiority in the very first days and mercilessly bombed the retreat routes of the enemy troops. Allied forces suffered heavy and bloody defeats against this all-out offensive, coming from both the air and the ground. On February 15, 1942, the British Empire's greatest fortress in Asia, known as the invincible Gibraltar of the East, Singapore, fell. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers out of ammunition and water, having suffered heavy casualties, surrendered unconditionally to the Japanese forces along with their command echelon. This surrender was not merely a military defeat, but the shattering of the centuries-old myth of invincibility held by Western colonial powers in Asia with a single signature. With the fall of Singapore, tens of thousands of Allied prisoners began death marches toward the dark and ruthless conditions of concentration camps. The iron fist of the Japanese Empire strictly crushed all civilian and military resistance in the region. Simultaneously with these victories, won in the north and the west, the Japanese Navy and ground troops turned toward their primary strategic target, the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. In the great naval battle that took place in the Java Sea, the Allied fleet was completely destroyed by Japanese warships and torpedoes. Following the securing of control over the sea, the region was rapidly occupied through amphibious landings. Japan, which was on the verge of suffocating due to the American embargo, seized the massive oil wells, rubber forests, and tin mines that would keep its army and heavy industry afloat for years, thanks to these occupations. All the raw material resources that the empire desperately needed to feed its war machine were secured using absolute force. These dizzying and early victories carried the rule of Hideki Tojo, sitting in the Prime Minister's office in Tokyo, to its brightest, strongest, and most invincible period. Every new news of conquest reaching the headquarters made his absolute authority within the state even more unshakable. With the psychological wind created by these military victories, Tojo officially declared to the world the vision of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which would shape the future of Asia. In state propaganda, this vision was presented as the ideal of liberating Asian nations from the yoke of Western imperialists and establishing a great continental union ruled by Asians. However, in reality, this project was a new, rigid, and uncompromising hegemony, where the resources of all occupied countries were transferred to the imperial center. Local populations were forced into obedience, and everything served solely the survival of the Japanese army. The map of Asia was redrawn in Tojo's hands, and the empire reached the most absolute peaks of its geographic power. In June 1942, the vast, deep, and dark waters of the Pacific Ocean witnessed one of the greatest turning points in military history. The sense of invincibility provided by the sudden victory at Pearl Harbor and the subsequent months of uninterrupted conquests in Southeast Asia propelled the Japanese combined fleet toward a new target with immense confidence. The target was Midway, a small coral island of strategic importance located in the very heart of the Pacific. The goal of the Japanese Navy was to draw the last remaining ships of the American Pacific Fleet into the open sea and completely destroy them in a decisive naval battle. However, as this colossal war machine cut through the foggy waves of the ocean, an invisible intelligence war sealed their fate. American intelligence units cracked the complex communication codes of the Japanese Navy and learned the time, target, and strength of this massive attack in advance with absolute certainty. When the dates showed June 4th, 1942, two massive fleets clashed near the shores of Midway. In the early hours of the morning, the sky roared with the deafening thunder of airplane engines. The wooden decks of the Japanese aircraft carriers brimmed with planes, loaded with fuel, and heavy bombs for a second wave attack. Exactly at this moment, American dive bombers glided through the clouds and locked onto their targets. The bombs, descending from the sky with sharp screams, shattered the decks of the ships that were the pride of the Japanese Empire in mere seconds. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These four giant aircraft carriers, which formed the backbone of Japanese naval power and stood as the invincible fortresses of the oceans, turned into massive fireballs through the chain reaction of detonating munitions and burning aviation fuel within them. Pitch-black smoke rising in the middle of the sea slowly sank into the depths of the ocean along with the burning heavy steel hulls. Thousands of elite Japanese sailors and irreplaceable, experienced pilots perished amidst the flames and dark waters. In just a few hours, the Japanese striking force, built through years of effort and spreading terror across the Pacific, turned into a massive pile of wreckage. As a result of the battle, four giant Japanese aircraft carriers sank to the bottom of the ocean. This heavy destruction abruptly and irreversibly shifted the strategic course of the Pacific War in favor of the Allies. Japan forever lost that ruthless offensive initiative it held since the beginning of the war in the waters of Midway. The Navy now had to set sail into the oceans for protection, not for conquest. The Imperial armies fell from the position of the hunter to the hunted on the Pacific chessboard. When the news of this staggering disaster, which took place thousands of kilometers across the ocean, reached the military headquarters in Tokyo, a deadly silence fell over the cold, stone corridors of the Ministry of War. Hideki Tojo and his high-ranking staff immediately realized that the picture they faced completely shattered the Empire's armor of invincibility. Behind the heavy doors of the headquarters, a dark decision emerged to keep the state standing and preserve morale. The Tojo government entirely concealed this heavy defeat, which broke the backbone of the Navy from the Japanese public. State radios, censored newspapers, and the entire bureaucratic apparatus severed the realities of the war from the people on the streets. Press organs fabricated fictional news claiming a glorious victory at Midway, announcing that American ships sank and the Japanese fleet returned to its bases with a decisive triumph. The massive propaganda machine of the state continued to wage a fake victory campaign to cover up the bloody reality of the thousands of soldiers and shattered steel ships lying at the bottom of the ocean. While civilians listened to false victory marches by their radios, deep and irreparable cracks opened in the invisible walls of the empire. As the balance shifted in the vast oceans of the Pacific after the heavy wound received at Midway, the focal point of the war moved to the deep, dark, and suffocating jungles of the islands. Long, extremely bloody, and grueling battles took place in the supposedly impassable tropical jungles of Guadalcanal and New Guinea. Soldiers fought not only against the enemy before them, but also against the unforgiving conditions of wild nature. Swamps, poisonous insects, torrential rains, and breathtaking heat turned these volcanic islands into giant green graveyards for both sides. Endless ambushes and trench warfare occurred under the merciless sun during the day and in the pitch-black darkness at night. The Imperial Japanese Army executed the largest expansion in its history and spread across thousands of kilometers, but the vital veins to feed this massive geography quickly dried up. American submarines silently patrolling the dark depths of the Pacific waters mercilessly severed the vital supply lines of the Japanese Army. Transport ships carrying weapons, ammunition, food, and medical supplies from the Japanese mainland to the front lines became the targets of torpedoes in the middle of the ocean. Steel ships sank into the dark waters in a matter of seconds, along with their priceless cargo and crew. With the collapse of the logistics network, the supposedly invincible massive war machine of the empire slowly paralyzed, left without fuel and ammunition. As the supply ships sank to the bottom of the ocean, a true nightmare began for the thousands of Japanese soldiers abandoned to their fate on the desolate islands of the Pacific. Completely cut off from logistical support and isolated on these islands, the soldiers struggled more with starvation and tropical diseases than with enemy bullets. Malaria, dysentery, and severe malnutrition turned the army camps into literal fields of death. Soldiers who failed to find even a single grain of rice for days, whose wounds rotted due to the lack of medicine, and who turned into skeletons, died silently in the depths of the jungles. The brilliant victories promised from the capital, Tokyo, gave way to the cruel, bloody, and starvation-filled reality of the Pacific Islands. In the military headquarters in Tokyo, the red defense perimeters on the giant maps shrank a little more each day. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's grand and invincible strategy that enveloped Asia shattered against the harsh waves of the Pacific. Tojo's strategy completely lost the initiative on the battlefield and became trapped in a gradually narrowing defense line. Dreams of expansion and conquest gave way to the effort to defend the existing islands to the death, down to the last soldier. Japan now became trapped in a desperate and bloody war of attrition, trying to protect every single trench at the cost of massive casualties. By July 1944, the fire of the war in the Pacific reached the vital defense perimeter of Japan. American forces launched a massive and devastating amphibious assault on the Mariana Islands, which the Japanese Empire designated as its absolute defense line. The horizon-illuminating fire of giant naval guns and sky-darkening air raids turned the shores of these volcanic islands into a literal hell. Japanese garrisons mounted a bloody resistance against the numerically and well-equipped superior American infantry, retreating into caves, underground tunnels, and dense jungles. However, after days of relentless combat and the continuous rain of giant artillery shells from the ocean, the Japanese defense lines collapsed one by one. Saipan Island, located in the strategic key position of this island chain, fell completely into the hands of American forces after an intense and ruthless bombardment. Thousands of Japanese soldiers defending the island and the civilians living there committed mass suicide by jumping off the high cliffs of the island to avoid capture and prove their loyalty to the emperor. The loss of Saipan was not merely a geographic defeat for Japan, but also the definitive bankruptcy of the entire defensive doctrine established since the beginning of the war. With the fall of Saipan, the dark shadow of the war struck directly at the heart of Japan for the first time. With the massive American air bases rapidly constructed on the island, the Japanese mainland now entered the direct range of American heavy bombers, the four-engine B-29 superfortresses. This small island in the middle of the ocean now became the main departure point for fleets carrying thousands of tons of incendiary bombs that would blanket the sky and reduce Tokyo and other industrial cities to ashes. The empire faced the greatest existential threat in its history. As this disastrous news reached the capital, the suppressed anger and panic in the political corridors of the empire erupted like a volcano. The absolute despair over the course of the war and the fear of approaching destruction deepened the cracks at the pinnacle of the state. In the capital, Tokyo, political, civilian, and military opposition to Tojo openly rebelled. High-ranking generals, experienced statesmen, and former diplomats launched a dark and swift political conspiracy to overthrow Prime Minister Tojo, whom they saw as the sole person responsible for the heavy defeats the army suffered and the impending catastrophe. The military dictatorship that ruled the country with an iron fist now shook under this unstoppable wave of rebellion rising from within, long before the Allied armies arrived. This massive military crisis, which began with the loss of Saipan and directly threatened the Japanese mainland, completely overturned the political balance in Tokyo. The anger accumulated over the years by high-ranking officials, senior generals, and the civilian bureaucracy within the empire turned into an open rebellion with this heavy defeat. The consecutive catastrophic losses suffered by the army and the navy shattered Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's indisputable authority over the state. Former prime ministers, imperial advisors, and even ministers in his own cabinet united against Tojo, demanding his immediate resignation to prevent the country from being dragged into the abyss. As a result of unbearable political pressures and severe criticisms from within the army, Hideki Tojo resigned from all his posts on July 18, 1944. That absolute power, which dragged Japan into war with an iron fist and sent millions of soldiers across Asia, ended silently with this decision made in the palace corridors. With Tojo leaving the seats of Prime Minister, Minister of War, and Chief of the General Staff, the helm of the empire's terrifying war machine completely changed hands. The management of the war transferred to new coalition governments, drowning in despair and crushed under the weight of impending definitive defeat. The former dictator Tojo lost all his power at the pinnacle of the state, completely stepped away from his active duties in the army, fell to the status of a reserve officer, and faded from the political stage. However, Tojo's departure did not suffice to dispel the darkness descending upon Japan. The final phase of the war became the most destructive and terrifying period the empire ever saw in its history. In the spring months of 1945, thousands of American B-29 heavy bombers taking off from the Mariana Islands darkened the sky of Japan. Massive industrial centers like Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya took hits from thousands of tons of napalm and incendiary bombs raining from the sky. Traditional Japanese cities, built of wood and paper, vanished from the map amidst massive firestorms that lasted for days. Hundreds of thousands of civilians turned to ashes under these relentless bombardments. Despite this, the Japanese army refused to surrender and continued its bloody resistance in Okinawa and on the mainland. However, in August, those two great catastrophes that forever changed the course of human history took place. The United States dropped atomic bombs consecutively on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A blindingly massive flash of light and the subsequent rising mushroom clouds vaporized the two cities in seconds. Hundreds of thousands of people perished in the horror of that moment. Almost simultaneously, the Soviet Union broke its neutrality pact and launched a heavy ground assault on the Japanese armies through Manchuria, all hopes of resistance completely exhausted in the face of both the nuclear destruction from the sky and the approaching Soviet threat from the land. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation by making an unprecedented broadcast on the state radio and announced that historic decision that ended the war. After the cities turned to ashes and the dropping of the atomic bombs, Japan surrendered unconditionally. That great Pacific storm, which turned Asia into a bloodbath, finally subsided among the nuclear ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In September 1945, as the destructive dust clouds of the war settled over the ruined streets of Tokyo, the victorious American army stepped onto the Japanese mainland. In the early days of the occupation, the headquarters of the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, General Douglas MacArthur, issued an order for the immediate arrest of the high-ranking Japanese leaders who started and waged the war. Hideki Tojo, the former absolute ruler of Japan, the leader of the war cabinet, and the chief architect of all the destruction in the Pacific, stood at the very top of this capture list. On the afternoon of September 11th, a convoy consisting of American military police, intelligence officers, and a large army of war correspondents completely surrounded Tojo's house in the Tokyo suburbs with an arrest warrant for him as a war criminal. As the house was tightly cordoned off, the cameras of the journalists and the barrels of the armed soldiers pointed directly at the front door. Inside, the former prime minister of a defeated empire silently made his final preparations. Tojo flatly refused to surrender in order to protect his military honor and avoid the shame of falling captive to the enemy. According to Japanese military tradition, it was an absolute rule for an officer to take his own life rather than live in captivity. However, instead of committing suicide with a traditional sword, he chose a modern, fast, and precise method. He previously marked the exact location of his heart on his chest with charcoal. In those tense seconds, when American soldiers prepared to break down the door and rush in, a deep and muffled gunshot echoed through the wooden walls of the house. Refusing to surrender, Tojo attempted to commit suicide by shooting himself in the chest, right over his heart, with the pistol in his hand. The soldiers who broke down the door and burst into the room found him slumped in an armchair, covered in blood, with a smoking pistol in his hand. However, the bullet missed his heart by mere millimeters and pierced through his lung. The American officers on the scene immediately initiated emergency intervention to prevent the man most responsible for the war from escaping justice through death. Tojo, bleeding heavily and on the verge of losing consciousness, rushed to the hospital in an American military ambulance. He survived as severely wounded and underwent an intensive treatment process in the military hospital by American surgeons and nurses. Paradoxically, his former enemies kept him alive by giving him American blood taken from their own soldiers so that they could bring him before justice. Being kept alive in a hospital bed became a cruel and humiliating defeat for him, and a great step taken for the establishment of justice for the Allies. His survival made him the prime defendant of the approaching historic trials. Now, the escape route through death closed completely, and the entire legal toll of the Pacific War fell onto the shoulders of this recovering ousted leader. After Hideki Tojo slowly recovered in the military hospital, the justice of the victors stepped in. In the spring of 1946, the specially prepared International Military Tribunal for the Far East opened its doors in Tokyo. The CIS tribunal was established to punish the architects of the war that ruined Asia and caused the deaths of millions of people. Tojo faced trial in this historic and massive tribunal as a Class A war criminal. The man who once sealed the fate of Asia as the absolute leader of the empire now fell to the position of a defeated prisoner sitting in the dock, listening to the indictments read by translators through the headphones on his head. The trials continued for months in an extremely heavy, gloomy, and tense atmosphere. Allied prosecutors proved Japan's aggressive war plans spanning many years, the ruthless policies executed against the civilian population in the occupied territories, and the inhumane treatment in prisoner of war camps, one by one, with countless documents, photographs, and witness testimonies. However, Tojo drew all attention with the unwavering and cold-blooded demeanor he displayed in the courtroom. Throughout the hearings, he single-handedly assumed all legal and military responsibility for the initiation and execution of the war. Faced with the severe charges, he showed no signs of remorse, defending that he did what was right for the survival of the state. His most critical and strategic move in his defense was to absolutely protect Emperor Hirohito, the figure residing at the very center of Japanese state tradition and belief. Before the tribunal panel, he gave clear statements asserting that the emperor favored peace from the very beginning, that the decision to go to war was made entirely by himself and his military cabinet, and that the emperor only approved these decisions out of constitutional obligation. These statements perfectly aligned with the American Occupation Administration's strategy of keeping the imperial institution intact to maintain order in Japan, and thus, the emperor remained completely out of the trials. After 2.5 years of lengthy testimonies, tens of thousands of pages of presented evidence, and endless legal deliberations, the tribunal announced its final verdict. Hideki Tojo was found guilty of committing crimes against peace, deliberately and ruthlessly ordering murders and violating the laws of war. He was sentenced to death by hanging by the decision of the tribunal. When the verdict was read to his face, he did not move a single muscle. He simply accepted the situation by slightly bowing his head. In the days when the freezing cold of winter wrapped around the ruined streets of Tokyo, the hour of execution approached. On December 23, 1948, the execution took place in the dark, high-walled, and heavily guarded Sugamo prison, where war criminals were held. As Tojo walked to the gallows, he showed no signs of resistance, regret, or fear. The trapdoor opened on the wooden floor of the gallows. And with the completion of the execution, the life of that general nicknamed the Razor, who once commanded massive armies, ended. Tojo's body burned in a crematorium, and American planes scattered his ashes over the Pacific Ocean. With this final breath, not only the life of one man, but the end of that dark and bloody era in Asia was sealed. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions in the comments so we can keep creating even better content for you. Hope to see you in the next video.